Nora had a rule, and the rule was simple. Never go home before the music stopped meaning anything. She had built her whole 20s around that rule without ever saying it out loud, and it had served her well enough. 3 in the morning was a friend. The bass line through her ribs was a kind of prayer. She would have laughed at anyone for calling a prayer. And the city outside the club doors was always waiting, wet and orange lit and full of people who didn't ask her real questions. She liked it that way. She liked the version of herself that lived only in those rooms, bright, loose, untouchable, the girl everyone wanted at their table and nobody quite knew. She had learned early that if you moved fast enough, nothing could land on you. Not grief, not love, not the particular silence of an empty apartment at 4 in the afternoon when the hangover finally cleared and there was nothing left to distract her from the fact that she didn't know what she was running from, only that stopping felt like dying a little. She had been a different girl once, a long time ago, the kind of detail she rarely let herself remember because remembering it made the distance between then and now feel unbearable. At 11, she had sung in a children's choir, standing in the second row in a white robe 2 sizes too big. And she had loved, actually loved with the whole unguarded heart of a child, the particular silence that fell over the church just before the organ began, that held breath moment where the whole building seemed to lean forward and listen. She did not remember when that love had curdled into something else. Perhaps it was 14 when her parents' marriage went quiet in the specific way marriages go quiet before they end, and the prayers she said at night stopped being answered in any way she could detect, and she decided, the way teenagers decide enormous things in small bedrooms at midnight, that either nobody was listening or nobody cared, and that believing otherwise was simply a way of making yourself smaller and more disappointable than you needed to be. She had been proud of that decision for a long time. She had worn it like a piece of jewelry. I don't believe in any of that. Tossed off lightly at parties, a small declaration of independence that made her feel modern and unbreakable, a woman who needed nothing outside herself to get through a Tuesday. By 26, she had perfected the architecture of a life that never had to sit still. She worked a job in marketing that she was good at and did not care about, the kind of job that paid for the version of herself she actually invested in. The nights, the dresses bought and barely worn twice, the rotating cast of friends who knew her laugh and her order, and absolutely nothing else. She moved through the city like she was always slightly late for something more interesting, and people found this magnetic, the way moths find a porch light magnetic, without ever asking what the light was actually burning to stay lit. Her sister, Talia, 2 years older and infinitely more patient, used to call her on Sunday mornings while Nora was still asleep from Saturday night, and the calls had grown shorter over the years, not from anger, but from a kind of tired resignation. "I just wanted to hear your voice, Nora. I'll let you sleep." And Nora would feel a small twist of guilt before rolling over and falling back asleep, because guilt, like everything else uncomfortable, was simply something to be slept through. Her father called less often than Talia, but said more when he did, and there was a particular quality to his voice in those last few years, careful, almost tender, the voice of a man choosing his words around something he didn't want to alarm her with, that she had noticed and chosen not to examine too closely, because examining it would have required stopping, and stopping was the one thing she had built her whole life specifically to avoid. She told herself this was simply who she was, free, light. A woman who didn't need anyone's God or anyone's rules, who had decided somewhere in her teenage years that the people who believed in things like that were people who hadn't yet learned how to hold their own lives together. And she had learned, hadn't she? She had learned so well. 3 jobs lost to mornings she couldn't make, 2 relationships that ended with the same tired sentence. "You're never really here, Nora, even when you're here." A string of friendships that thinned out year by year because she could not be reached, could not be found, was always one more party away from the version of herself anyone could actually count on. She told herself she was happy. She told herself this most convincingly at 2 in the morning, surrounded by strangers, the lights moving across her skin like something almost holy, almost, and she never let herself finish that thought. Then her father died on an ordinary Tuesday, of a heart that had been quietly failing for longer than anyone had told her, and the call came while she was still asleep from the night before, Mascara dried in the corners of her eyes, and she sat up in bed and listened to her sister's voice break apart over the phone and felt something in her chest simply stop, the way a song stops when someone pulls the plug. Not fading, just gone, an absence so total it had a sound of its own. The days that followed moved through her rather than the other way around. She remembered them later only in fragments, the specific gray of the sky on the drive to her parents' house, the way her mother's hands had shaken pouring coffee. Nobody drank. Talia sitting on the porch steps at 2 a.m. saying nothing at all, just letting Nora sit beside her in a silence that had no bottom to it. She remembered finding, folded inside her father's desk drawer, a stack of cards he had clearly bought and never sent, birthday cards, 3 years' worth, each one signed Love Always, Dad in his careful old-fashioned handwriting, and beneath the signature on the most recent one, a single unfinished sentence. I know you're finding your own way, and I just want you to know. The sentence stopped there. She sat on the floor of his study and held that card for a long time, trying to finish it herself, and could not. She went to the funeral in black clothes that still smelled faintly of someone else's cigarettes, and she stood at the grave and did not cry, because crying required a kind of stillness she had spent 10 years training herself out of, and instead she felt a terrible hollow ringing, like a bell that had been struck and would not stop, and she went home that night and did the only thing she knew how to do, which was go out, find a room loud enough to drown the ringing, find people who would not ask her how she was actually doing. It did not work. For the first time in her life, it simply did not work. She stood in the middle of the dance floor with the bass moving through her like it always had, surrounded by people shouting happy things into each other's ears, a boy she didn't know offering her a drink with a smile that asked for nothing real. And she understood, watching it all from somewhere slightly outside herself, that she could see exactly what this was for the first time in 10 years. Not freedom, not lightness, but a very elaborate, very expensive way of not being anywhere at all. The bass moved through her like it always had, and the bell kept ringing underneath it, louder than the music, louder than anything, and she understood with a kind of horror she had never let herself feel, before that she had nowhere left to run to, that she had spent 10 years building a life made entirely of exits. And now, for the first time, every door led back to the same room, and the room had her father in it, gone, and grief sitting in the corner of it like something that had been waiting very patiently for her to finally come home and find it there. She left the club without telling anyone, and walked for 2 hours through streets she didn't recognize, even though she'd lived in that city her whole life, and somewhere around 3 a.m, cold and shaking, and finally crying, the kind of crying that comes up out of the body like something being torn loose. She found herself standing outside a small church with its door left slightly open, light spilling out gold onto the wet pavement, an old woman inside lighting a candle though the building was otherwise empty. And Nora stood on the sidewalk for a long time, not entering, just watching the small flame through the gap in the door, and something in her, some old, buried, almost forgotten part of her, the part that used to stand in a white robe 2 sizes too big, and love the held breath silence before the organ began, wanted, with a longing so sudden and so enormous it frightened her, to go inside. She did not go inside that night. She stood there until her feet went numb, and the old woman inside finished whatever she was doing and left through a side door without ever seeing her. And Nora walked home alone through streets going quiet and blue with the approach of dawn, and she told herself, climbing into bed still in her funeral clothes, that it had meant nothing, that grief made people sentimental and stupid, that she would feel like herself again by morning. She did not feel like herself again by morning. She woke up at noon with the ringing still there, fainter but present, like a held note that refuses to fully resolve, and she lay in bed for 3 hours doing nothing, which was itself unprecedented. She could not remember the last time she had simply lain still and let a feeling exist without immediately reaching for her phone, her makeup, her coat, anything to carry her out of the room and into somewhere louder. The wanting from the night before hadn't left. It had only gotten quieter, settled somewhere under her ribs like a small, persistent ember, and 3 days later, without telling anyone, without even fully deciding to, she found herself walking back to that same church on a gray Sunday morning. She stood outside it for almost 10 minutes before she made herself go in, her hand on the heavy wooden door, half expecting someone to stop her, to ask what right she had to be there after 10 years of mockery dressed up as wit, after every joke she'd made at the expense of people who believed in things she'd decided were beneath her. Nobody stopped her. Nobody even looked up. She slid into the very back pew where no one would notice her, and the church was perhaps a third full, ordinary people in ordinary coats, an elderly man 2 rows up who sang slightly flat and didn't seem to mind, a young mother bouncing a fussy baby against her shoulder, and Nora sat among them feeling like an intruder in her own grief, certain that everyone could see exactly how lost she was. No one looked at her at all. That, more than anything, was what undid her, that she did not have to perform anything in that room, did not have to be bright or loose or untouchable, could simply sit there broken and unfinished, and be, for the first time in years, entirely herself, and nobody required anything different of her. She did not pray, not exactly. She did not know how anymore. The words she'd known at 11 had rusted shut somewhere inside her, but she sat in the stillness and let it hold her, the way nothing in 10 years of loud rooms had ever managed to hold her. And partway through, without warning, she began to cry, quietly, into her own hands, her shoulders shaking, and the woman beside her, a stranger, simply reached over without a word and pressed a folded tissue into her palm, the smallest possible kindness, offered and received without either of them speaking. And Nora held onto that tissue afterward for days, unable to throw it away, as though it had become evidence that something gentle still existed in the world and had reached her exactly when she needed it to. She went back the next Sunday, and the one after that. She did not transform overnight, and she would have distrusted it if she had. Grief does not resolve in a single gesture. Faith does not arrive like a light switching on, and there were still nights in those early weeks when the old pull returned, when she stood outside a club she used to love with her hand on the door, aching for the version of herself that didn't have to feel anything. And what stopped her, more than once, was not willpower, but the memory of that small gold flame spilling onto wet pavement, the memory of sitting in a quiet room and finally being allowed to fall apart, the slow understanding that she had spent 10 years running from a silence she had never actually tested, certain it was empty, never once stopping long enough to find out it wasn't. There was one particular night, almost a month in, when she failed entirely. Went out with old friends because one of them was leaving the city and it felt unkind to refuse, and found herself 3 drinks in, laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny, and somewhere around midnight excused herself to the bathroom and stood gripping the edge of the sink, staring at a version of her own face she barely recognized, made up and lit by unkind fluorescent light, and she felt the old emptiness rushing back in to fill the space the church had been slowly clearing, and she cried again that night too, but uglier, angrier, furious with herself for backsliding so easily, for proving that maybe none of it had taken root at all. She left without saying goodbye to anyone, and took a taxi home and lay on her bathroom floor at 2 a.m. and said, out loud, to no one, to the tile and the dark and whatever might be listening, I'm sorry, I don't know how to do this. Please don't give up on me the way I always give up on myself. It was not elegant. It did not feel like a breakthrough, but she went back to the church the following Sunday anyway, shame and all, and an old priest she had spoken to only briefly before, a quiet man with tired, kind eyes, found her in the back pew afterward and said only, "Grace doesn't run out, you know. You can come back as many times as you need to." She did not know, until he said it, how badly she had needed permission to fail and try again. She began to pray badly and honestly, in her own words, in her kitchen, in the dark, the way you talk to someone you are only just getting to know, fumbling, uncertain, sometimes just sitting in silence because she didn't know what to say, and trusted, slowly, that the silence itself might be enough. She bought a small, worn Bible from a second-hand shop and read it the way she might read a letter from someone she'd lost touch with, hungrily, guiltily, looking for the parts that might explain her own life back to her. She found, to her great surprise, that she did not hate it the way she had assumed she would. She found whole passages that felt like they had been waiting for her specifically, sentences about weary souls and burdens and rest that she read 3 and 4 times, her hand pressed flat against the page as though she could absorb them through her palm. Talia noticed before anyone else did. Her sister called one Sunday evening, the call she had grown used to keeping short, and Nora answered fully awake, present, asking real questions, and there was a long pause on the other end before Talia said carefully, "You sound different." And Nora, surprising herself, told her the truth. The club, the ringing, the church door left open, the tissue from the stranger, all of it. And Talia was quiet for a long moment and then said, her voice thick, "Dad used to pray for you every single night. He told me once. He said he didn't care what you believed. He just wanted you to find your way home eventually." Nora sat with the phone pressed to her ear and cried for the third time that week. And this time it did not feel like falling apart. It felt like something finally being returned to her. She found, to her own astonishment, that the ringing in her chest began to quiet, not all at once, but the way a fever breaks, degree by degree, night by night, until one morning she woke up and realized the bell had finally gone still, and in its place was something she had no name for yet, but which felt, unmistakably, like peace. She stopped going to the clubs, not because she decided to, but because she simply stopped needing them, the way you stop needing a coat once the weather turns warm, and the friends who had only ever known her loud and untouchable fell away, gently, without drama, and the ones who remained were the ones who had been quietly waiting all along for her to come back to herself. She found, too, that she had room now for things she'd never had room for before. She started volunteering on Wednesday evenings at a shelter 2 blocks from the church, serving soup to people whose names she learned and remembered, and she found in that small, unglamorous work a satisfaction so quiet and so complete that it made the old nights of bright lights and bottle service feel, in retrospect, almost embarrassing in their hunger, as though she had spent 10 years trying to fill a very specific shape with the wrong material entirely. A year later, she stood at her father's grave again, on the anniversary, and this time she did not feel hollow. She brought the unfinished birthday card with her, the one from his desk drawer, and she read his handwriting one more time. "I know you're finding your own way, and I just want you to know." And for the first time, she understood she could finish that sentence herself, that she had become, finally, the daughter that incomplete sentence had been waiting for. She felt his absence the way you feel the shape of a room you've grown to love, present, aching, but no longer terrifying, because she was no longer alone inside it. She closed her eyes and said his name, and for the first time since she'd lost him, she prayed without flinching, without bracing for an empty room, and the wind moved through the cemetery trees the way it always had, and somewhere underneath the ordinary sound of it, she felt, quietly, certainly, held. She went home that evening and lit a single candle on her kitchen table and sat with it a long while, watching the small flame the way she had once watched one through a half-open door. And she thought about the girl she used to be, running through bright, loud rooms trying to outpace a grief she didn't even know yet was coming. And she felt, not shame, but a kind of tenderness for her. That girl had only ever been looking for the same thing Nora had finally found, only she hadn't known yet where to look. She thought of the choir robe, 2 sizes too big, and the held-breath silence before the organ began, and understood that she had not become someone new this past year, so much as she had finally found her way back to someone she had always, underneath everything, still been. She blew out the candle before bed, and the room went dark, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the dark did not feel like something to escape. It felt like rest. It felt, at last, like home.